HSC exam for many years and has 20 years of teaching experience and was the head teacher, worked in leadership at a top performing independent school, as well as Nara, who has achieved 9 Band 6s in the HSC, alongside a 48 out of 50 in English Extension 1 and a 49 out of 50 in English Extension 2. So we're very honored to have them tonight. Today, the speakers are going to provide a very detailed analysis and explanation of the English HSC exam reforms for the class of 2027, as well as tips and tricks for exam preparation through the lens of the HSC, developing interests and skills beyond exams. There will be a Q&A at the end, so if you have any questions, you can either send them to me in a direct message, and I'll read it to the speakers, or you can drop them in the chat at the end. We are recording and we're able to provide a video if you request it later. However, please do not record or take screenshots of the webinar's contents because they belong to the presenters and Top Logic. So just to repeat myself, no recording or screenshots are allowed. So I'm very happy to pass the microphone, metaphorically, to Mrs. Harper, who will start her presentation.
Thank you, Minnie. Okay, I think it's interesting there. I think there's a lot of discussion about what the HSC perhaps will look like for the 2027 year group, because that will be the first year group that go through with the new prescriptions and the new syllabus. But in actual fact, not much has changed, and the HSC exam hasn't really changed. So the only big change is really Extension 2. Where rather than just doing a major work, which Nara would have done and got a 49 out of 50 for her major work when she did it, which is fantastic. Now you will do a depth study through with an author, where you look at an author and the idea of author and authority, and that's really the big change. There will be an exam related to that. So in terms of the exam for Advanced and Extension 1, there's not really a lot of change. There is in terms of Module C, you don't have the prescriptions anymore, but essentially it's pretty much the same. So I'll just share my screen. Okay. Minnie, you can see that okay?
That yes, we can see it.
Yep. Yeah, perfect. Okay. All right. So in terms of the timeline, this is what it looks like for the new HSC. We got the new prescriptions. We got the new syllabus. And that didn't really mean a whole lot until you get the prescriptions. You know what you're actually teaching for the HSC. So we've received now the new prescriptions, and they were given to schools this term. The new prescriptions will be implemented from 2026. Although schools go about that really next year, they will be designing all of that, and then the implementation happens in 2026. So that will be from year 11, because you're back with MAPIC from the HSC. And then in 2027, that will be the new exam. And when I say new exam, the exam format hasn't changed for Advanced and Extension. It is just that there's new prescriptions. So the texts are quite different. There are a couple of texts that they've kept, but in actual fact, there's a lot of differences in terms of the text that students will study. There is a big focus on Australian texts, which is good, but particularly for texts and human experiences, which we haven't had before. So that's something that will be really new for students. This is what it looks like in terms of English Advanced. So this image on your screen tells us what the year 11 modules are, and then what we move into for year 12. And essentially they're the same. So you go from reading to write to narratives that shape our world and a critical study of literature in year 11. Just like it has been, students will have to do the reading to write unit first. So they study that one first because that's their transition to English Advanced. And then they can study narratives that shape our world and the critical study of literature in any order. So that will be up to schools. There are no prescribed texts for year 11 still. So the NSW does not prescribe text for year 11. Instead, that is the text that students study, are decided at a school level, and schools generally will choose those texts based on what they've decided for year 12. So essentially what will happen is we've been given new prescriptions for year 12. Schools will go about deciding, so I'm doing it at my school, we will go about deciding what we will teach in year 12. And then from that, we will backward map that into year 11 and then down. And so our year 11 text will be informed by what we're actually choosing for year 12. And the reason for that is to make sure that students are set up for the skills that they'll need in year 12. So then in year 12, again, the texts, the modules essentially haven't changed. You do text and human experiences, textual conversations, the critical study of literature, and the craft of writing. So they're all essentially the same. What is really interesting is this text and human experiences module. And that is the focus on Australian text for that. So that when the prescriptions came out, essentially there's barely anything at all on there that we have done before. In actual fact, some of the things, when I said done before, done recently, but some of the texts that they put on are from a long time ago, and because I'm old, I remember them. And a lot of students will never have come across them and will never have studied them. So there's things like An Imaginary Life by David Malouf. There's short stories by Henry Lawson. So they're part of the prose fiction. So for text and human experiences now, you have an option to do prose fiction, poetry, drama, film, media, or non-fiction. But that will depend on what teachers choose there, will depend on what they're actually choosing in other modules. Because like at the moment, you are prescribed that you have to do a prose. So you've got to do a prose text. So schools may choose to do that prose text in their text and human experiences module. And as I said, that would be the Jessica Howe one, Cold Enough for Snow, or David Malouf, or Henry Lawson. That would be the prose fiction. Or schools may choose not to do prose fiction here. They might do their prose fiction in another module. And instead they might do the poetry for this section. And the poetry for advanced are things like Rosemary Dobson's poems, Gwen Harwood, just a bit of a blast from the past, that one. Samuel Wagon Watson, another one. What the board, what NSW does is it recycles a lot of texts from the past. But what we see is, as I said, there's a real focus on Australian text. Then drama, film, media, or non-fiction, we've got Richard Flanagan, Question 7, which is non-fiction. Michael Gow's Away, which I don't think has been on since the 90s. If I'm correct, maybe I'm incorrect in that, but it hasn't been on for it was on a long, long time ago. Rachel Perkins' One Night the Moon. One Night the Moon is a text that was studied in standard English and is still studied in standard English at the moment, but it's made its way onto the text and human experiences text list. So that's an interesting one as well. Then what students do is they go into either the textual conversations, the critical study of literature, and the craft of writing. The same as it is now, you have to do text and human experiences first. So all students will come into their HSC year and they'll have to do that. Just like in year 11, they have to do reading to write as their first unit. Then the other three modules can be studied in any order. What's important to remember is that text and human experiences, just as it is now, that is the common module. It is the one that both advanced and standard students study. It does make up, so the HSC exam is still worth 100 marks. So it's now going, in 2019, it went to 5 sections rather than the old 6 sections we used to have. There's no more 15-mark questions or anything like that, like it used to be in the old system. It used to be marked at about 105 in the old system. but now it's marked out of 100, and that they have maintained that. So it's 5 sections marked out of 100, each section worth 20 marks. What is really significant, which a lot of students don't give enough time to, is that text and human experiences, it looks like, if you look at that image on the screen, it looks like all of those modules and the boxes are all the same size, that each of those modules is of equal value, and they're not. Text and human experiences make up 40 of the possible 100 marks of the HSC. And often schools will do that module in term 4, which is the shortest term of the HSC year. So they'll do it in term 4, and they'll probably have about at max 9 weeks on it, if that. If you're at a public school, you might get 9 weeks out. If you're at a private independent school, sometimes that can be about 7 weeks because our terms are so short, because going into the Christmas holidays. So it means that you're doing a large chunk of your HSC exam paper within a very short period of time. And so students just need to be mindful of that. What I see is students not giving enough time to it, thinking it is a section where you do the comprehension and you do the essay on text and human experiences. And because students have done the comp, a number of times and generally at school in their exams and so on, they think that they've pretty much got that covered. And whilst they may, it is a section where you're really trying to absolutely maximize that. So trying to get, 20 out of 20 for that comp. And those questions can be hard. Unlike previously in 2019, they changed it so that the comprehension paper was not the same for advanced and standard students. Instead, what we know is that they will be common questions. Now, the HSC, it says at least 3 items will be common to standard English. So the HSC Advanced English examination for section 1, so you have 2 papers and you have paper 1, section 1, which is the comprehension. You spend about 45 minutes on it. It's worth 20 marks. It has 5 to 6 short answer questions. Now they've said that. In the past, it could have been 4. The saying now is that there will be 5 or 6 short answer questions. So that's quite a lot. The questions may contain parts. They will be based on the stimulus or unseen text related to text and human experiences, and at least 3 of those items will be common to English standard. So 2 to 3 of the items of those questions will not be, which means that they will be for advanced students only. They will be the more difficult questions. The reason that we have the commonality between them is to, that's about how we actually determine the difficulty of the courses and the difference between them, between advanced and standard. Section 2 will have 1 question. It is where you're required to write an extended response. It will include, or may include, doesn't have to, a stimulus and or unseen text, and it will be common to English standard. So the essay for text and human experiences, for this one here, that will be common between English advanced and English standard. These 3 modules here are for advanced students only. So the textual conversations, I shouldn't say, the craft of writing actually is standard do that as well, but there is it's an advanced level that the advanced students do it. So the textual conversations is the comparative study module. And normally what happens in year 11 is that the narratives that shape our world, students will study a comparison, they'll compare text, they'll look at narratives across time and they'll compare them, and that is to set them up for the textual conversation in year 12. That textual conversation, as I said, is one where students are comparing text, so it's a comparative study. Students will compare a pair of texts from the prescriptions list, and again, there's been some really interesting texts that have been put onto that, and they've diverged from what has traditionally been the case, where there's been a very clear conversation between the texts. So that conversation has been that there is a latter text that has been in a dialogical relationship deliberately with an earlier text. But now we've got texts like Emily Dickinson's poetry that will be looked at in terms of Hamlet. So it'll be really interesting in terms of the comparative study and how that, what that looks like for Year 12, because it's a little bit different. But it is different, but then there's lots of similarities in the sense that there's a focus again on the relationship between the reader, the author, the text, and the context. So what we know is that students really need to have a strong understanding of how context shapes text within this module. The syllabus again talks about the meta-language and textual construction, and that's really important, and this idea of close critical analysis of these texts. So the textual conversation one, you're not just comparing text, but you're looking at their context. You're ensuring that you understand the meta-language of the particular text and the way they are constructed. And that textual construction is really important, and how it is, it's really important to think about for textual conversations, how that choice of construction actually is a manifestation of the composer reacting to their world. So that's about their context. So how that world is shaping deliberate choices, both in terms of, well, not only in terms of language, but in terms of form and structure of the text. And again, like I said, that meta language is really important. So knowing the language of your text, knowing that the difference between the language that we use to talk about film, which, you know, in film, you're talking about different shot types. You're talking about diegetic and non-diegetic sounds and so on. Whereas when you're talking about prose fiction, the language that you're using, the meta language, is very different. So there is a particular type of language to different forms of text, just as at school there is a different meta language for each discipline, and even within a discipline, within those, you know, between different subjects within a discipline. If you think of science, there's different language that you may use in biology than, you know, than the language you use in physics and chemistry and so on. So each discipline, each subject has its own language, just as in English. Each textual form has its own language, and it's really important that students understand that. For that, for textual conversation, it is the hardest module out of all of them, I would say, and because you're trying to grapple with two texts, and they are two robust texts and quality pieces of literature. And not only are you looking at them individually and what they're saying, you're actually looking at the conversation that happens between them. So you're comparing them, and that comparison is really important. And you're really thinking about how they are speaking to each other. The other thing that the new syllabus does is it really breaks down those skills. And if you look at in terms of the textual conversations module, it really focuses on how authors are influenced by other texts, influenced by context and values and how they're shaping meaning. The values part is really important. It's often a part that students don't do particularly well. It gets rid of those terms. I should say it uses the terms that we're used to now, which are the resonances and dissonances within and between texts, which is actually really important. So that's a more nuanced thing than just saying that text has similarities and differences, because that's about mirroring and echoing, which is really important. So students will be looking at them through really the frame that they had in previous years. And so there's not that much difference with that one, except for the text that you're doing. There are some that have been kept. So some schools may actually keep doing what they've been doing. So Keats and Bright Star is still on there, which is interesting that they've kept that one. But schools that have been doing Richard III and Looking for Richard, for example, that's no longer an option. Or The Tempest and Hagseed, it's no longer an option. So lots of schools do it. That'll be off. So students won't be able to do those. Instead, there's texts like Julius Caesar and Machiavelli's The Prince that have been brought on instead. Then we go to the critical study of literature, and it aligns obviously with the critical study of literature in the advanced Year 11 course. And that really, again, is where students are doing a deep dive into a quality text. So rather than looking at two texts, now you're looking at one and you're doing that deep dive into that text for the advanced English course. And it's probably the one that students find the easiest. And that is because they're dealing with one text. It is the one where students have to undertake a detailed analytical and critical knowledge of a really substantial text. And the key for that one, as has always been the case, is that personal response to the text. I mean, that actually goes for every module, but they explicate that in the critical of study rubric. So it's one prescribed text. Students have to focus on the distinctive qualities of the text, the notion of meaning and its significance. Significance means its enduring significance across time. So essentially, you've been given a quality text. Why does this text endure throughout time? Texts that have made the list for that one, which is interesting. So at the moment, there's T.S. Eliot is on there, but T.S. Eliot is no longer on. Instead, for the poetry, something like William Butler Yeats is back on. So Yeats was taken off a while ago. Eliot was put on, and now Eliot's off and Yeats is back on. But some of the poems that they have included, say, for Yeats, are again ones that have not been on the HSC for a very, very long time. In fact, An Acre of Grass and Long-Legged Fly were on in the 1990s. I think they were last on in 2000, and it was a very long time ago. And they were on for 3, when we used to have the old 3-unit English course, back in the days where there wasn't even a 4-unit English. It didn't exist. So that's very interesting that they've put those on. Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice is on, and a number of other texts and some Australian texts so schools will have to make those choices and decide. But an example of perhaps the thinking that goes on there for schools would be something like, well, if we're putting Yeats on, what do you do in Year 11 then for your critical study? And often what schools will do is, if they've been studying Eliot, they'll put Eliot on, because Eliot is a modernist poet, and his context is very aligned to the context of Yeats. And so it sets up very nicely a nice critical study, an introduction to the critical study in Year 11 that then students extend in year 12, but they're doing a different composer, but essentially you're able to look at a lot of the context in the year 11 study. The Shakespeare texts have also changed. So Othello, lots of students study Othello in year 11. So there's lots of students now across the state, a whole lot of them, studying Othello in year 11. But Othello is now on from 2027, has made it back on the HSC for 2027, and it was last on in 2000. And King Henry IV Part 1, though, they've kept that, and it's on at the moment. So they've actually kept that one. And there's, like I said, there's not much change for that one. Again, in terms of the HSC exam, what does that look like for this text? Both, paper 2 is where we study textual conversations, critical study of literature, and the craft of writing. So those 3 modules all take place in paper 2, worth 60 marks. There's essentially 1 question on each of those texts. So it's 3 sections, 1 question on those prescribed texts. That students write a sustained response to, extended response. Section 3 of that exam is the craft of writing. And it's, again, it's pretty much the same. There will be 1 question, they've said, but it can be in 2 parts, which is the same as what you get now. Sometimes you get a question that requires students to do an imaginative response, and then they might have to write a reflection, or this year's one was a persuasive or a discursive. You got to choose, and then you might have to write a reflection. And the question can include a stimulus and/or unseen text. The difference is that in the past you have had to 2019, when Module C was added, in terms of the craft of writing, there were prescribed texts that students had to study, and they've taken those away. So that's a shift. That's a difference for that one. Okay, so I've gone through, they're just, again, the modules for year 11, what they are. This transition to advanced English, the reading to write, is where students study a number of texts, and it sets them up both for text and human experiences. It also sets them up for the craft of writing. So it's where students will study a number of different forms of text, which is really, really important. It's important that students have a really robust understanding of the different textual forms that they can be asked to write in. So for the craft of writing, that is the imaginative, discursive, persuasive, and/or reflective response. It used to be, they used to have on there informative. They've taken that away. They don't mention that now. It just is imaginative, discursive, persuasive, and/or reflective response. So you've got to be across those 4 things for the craft of writing for the HSC, and it's in this reading to write, the transition to advanced English. That's where students start to really hone those skills, but they should have been honing them as well throughout their journey through English, even in their junior years. Again, they're the HSC advanced modules, which I went through. The English extension course, again, there's not much difference here. Extension 1 for year 11 is still text, culture, and value. That's what it was before. There's still the related research project, so that still exists. You still have to do that. And then that leads you into English Extension 1. Now, in order to do English Extension 1, you have to have done English Extension in year 11. My advice would be, if you want to get better at English and you're worried about your advanced English marks, I would undertake Extension English in year 11 and and you may think, well, I don't want to do it for year 12, and what you do is you do it in year 11 and you drop it for year 12. But, you know, particularly if English perhaps isn't a strength and you want to get better, that extension course is a really valuable course. And if you're looking for that band 6 in advanced English, sometimes it's really worthwhile taking the extension English course and then in year 11 and then dropping it. In fact, there's some selective schools who actually mandate that students have to do extension English in year 11 for that reason, because it's essentially more training for the subject. Then you move into literary worlds, but in that in English extension 1 for year 12, there are different electives. So these are the electives. They've all changed. They are not what they used to be, or what they are, sorry, currently. The names have changed. What you've got to do is change a little bit, but there is a fair bit of overlap. So at the moment we have things, you know, like imaginative worlds and so on. Now we've got things like historical worlds, confessional worlds, etc. But for example, the historical worlds is really one that has that aligns with one of the modules we do at the moment. The confessional worlds is a little bit different. Shakespearean worlds they brought on, that's actually one from a long time ago. That's going back a while, that one, if you want to. There's nothing really on the HSC at the moment, the extension 1 course, that aligns with that. It does kind of remind you, though, of the very old 1990s one where you used to study Shakespearean texts in extension. But that's where they've put on, so Hagseed was off for advanced, and they put Hagseed onto Shakespearean worlds for elective side. So that's why it's off for advanced. Merchant of Venice is off for advanced, and they've put that into the Shakespearean worlds. And so, for example, in that one, it's where students would consider the nature and characteristics of the worlds of Shakespeare's works. So they're exploring, interrogating, and evaluating the way the worlds can be referenced, reconstructed, extended, or subverted in other texts. So then you've got to look at things like, you know, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are Dead, which I've been teaching to the year 11s at the moment at Top Logic, because it is a transformation in terms of that text of Hamlet. So it's taking these two characters from Hamlet, who are kind of minor characters, and building an absurdist drama around them. So that's actually come back onto the HSC, and it is in for elective 5 in extension. And the year 11s have been, the classes at Top Logic were the year 11, so it's the year 10s have been looking at Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are Dead, thinking that it sets them up very nicely for the extension course. Okay, then extension 2 is where the big difference is. So there is a kind of depth study that you do on author and authority. Yes, the major work still exists. Yes, it's worth a significant part of your final mark, but it's not, rather than your extension 2 piece being 100% of your mark, is no longer the case. So instead, you'll do the exam and also do the major work. And it'll be interesting to see exactly what that exam looks like, and how it all fits together for the extension 2 students. But that major work is also pared back as well. So that's the extension 2. In terms of the HSC examination, like I said, really there's not much significant change when it comes to English Advanced. That examination is still pretty much the same. So it hasn't really changed. The modules haven't really changed in terms of what you've got to do for Advanced. It is just that the prescriptions have changed. So the key takeaways, I guess, for the examination for Advanced is that it is very much like it is now. There is a little bit in terms of section 1, paper 1, because it's saying that there's 5 to 6 short answer questions. 3 of them are now going to be common, but that's not much of a difference. Section 2 for paper 1 is essentially the same, and again, like it is today, it's the same question as the advanced students do that standard students do. Potential conversations question for paper 2. It's the first section, which is exactly what it is in the HSC now, and it's 1 question. It's an extended response. It can include a stimulus. All of that is the same as what it is now. The critical study of literature, 1 question, an extended response, and it can include a stimulus. Again, exactly the same as what it is now. The craft of writing, like I said, the difference there is that it doesn't talk about informative text anymore. It says there'll be 1 question. It can be in parts, exactly the same as what it is now. You have to do an imaginative, discursive, persuasive, and/or reflective response, and it can include a stimulus or unseen text. So that is the same. However, the difference is there's no prescribed text for Module C. In terms of extension 1, again, that exam, there's not much difference at all. And extension 2 is where the big change has happened, and that is that you'll have an exam that accompanies that subject.
We'll move on to Nara's presentation.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. So thank you everyone for being here today, and thank you, Mrs. Harper, for that. That was really informative for me as well. But I'll be sharing a bit of my experience after going through the HSC and some tips on time management in general, not just for English. Okay, so firstly, I'll go through general English tips, then some of my approaches to essays, thirdly, my approaches to creatives, and finally, time management for HSC in general. So firstly, onto some general tips I have for HSC English. First thing I would say is know your syllabus really well. So the syllabus should direct your focus. Like when you're reading your texts, you should be keeping in mind what the syllabus wants you to look at, whether it wants you to focus on, like for Module A, the connections with the other text you have, or whether it wants more of a focus on these universal human experiences that the common module asks for. And you'll find the syllabus on the NESA site, and on it as well, there's marker feedback from previous years, and also sometimes suggested answers for the short answer comprehension section. I would really recommend closer to HSC looking at those, or even if you can find other schools' trial papers online, looking at some other sample answers teachers have written up, because it'll help you prepare a lot for the comprehension part of the common module, which is easy to underestimate, but a lot of times you might get into the exam, you read a completely new text and you kind of freeze up. So make sure to kind of prepare as much as you can for the comprehension as well. Don't underestimate it. So the second thing I'd say is use your resources wisely. So obviously you have your class teachers, pester them politely, the earlier the better. So as you get closer to the HSC or during your trials, they're inundated with 120 essays to mark. So if you can, straight after task 1, you get your feedback, go home, apply it within that week. And if your teacher lets them, you can then go to them to discuss, ask if maybe they can look over your essay, or if you have sort of a narrative plan in your head you want to discuss with them. I'd say do that earlier in the year, in year 11 or at the start of year 12, because if you wait with all your questions until the week before HSC, sometimes they just might not be able to get to it. You might not get as much feedback as you want on your pieces. Obviously, ask your tutors lots of questions. Peer editing can be really helpful. And also you can even ask your family or friends not in your school to read over some of your creatives. So for example, for my major work, I sent it to maybe 10 people in total just to get different perspectives on it. So don't be afraid to ask for help. There are also online resources you can use. For example, there's lots of quote banks online. Obviously, look through with a discerning eye because lots of what you see online is not the most useful or it's very stock standard. But sometimes you might come across a really interesting piece of context that you might want to use after cross-checking or things like that. There's also the State Library website, which has a lot of exemplar English Extension 2 reflections. So obviously, if you're doing Extension 2, that's really useful. But even if you're doing Advanced or Extension, it can still be helpful to see how some of the really highly regarded reflections, what they look like. And there's also JSTOR or other academic article sites that you can use to access critic analysis of different texts. So you'll be able to see how academics analyze these texts. You can get different perspectives on texts, and obviously you can incorporate critic quotes into your own essays. So that can be really useful. So the third tip is a couple of things to note during the actual HSC exam when you're doing English. I think firstly, it's really important to set yourself strict deadlines on when to move on. So for example, for question 1 of comprehension, I'll spend 5 minutes on it and then no matter what, I have to move on. What happens a lot is sometimes you get into the exam, first question, you panic and you start overwriting, and that kind of messes up the entire rest of your exam because you don't have time for your essay's unfinished, things like that. So you need to get really disciplined, starting from your school assessments, be really strict on yourself when it comes to deadlines you set for yourself in the exam. Second thing is use your reading time efficiently. So in HSC paper 1, for example, when you have all your unseen texts for comprehension, read over those in your planning time. Don't do things like trying to revise your quotes in your head because that's mostly a waste of time. Trust that you've memorized your quotes enough. Just use your reading time to read over new content and to kind of brainstorm what you're going to say once writing time begins. And then for essays especially, focus on whatever question the paper gives you the whole way through. So sometimes what happens is you write an intro that really adheres to the question, but then as you start writing, you end up copying down the essay you've prepared and you almost forget the question halfway through. So every time you're doing a piece of analysis or you're ending a sentence, try and make sure mentally in your head to check back, am I answering the question closely? Have I understood the question correctly? Things like that. And finally, it seems simple, but make sure your handwriting is legible. When you're trying to write 1,200 words in 40 minutes, oftentimes it gets really scrolly. So if you know handwriting is a problem for you, starting like year 10, you should be trying to practice more, writing quicker and making it legible. Okay. And fourthly, I would say pick up more units of English. This is especially if you're in year 10 right now. I think there are a couple really good reasons. So firstly, like Mrs. Harper said, it helps you develop your skills in English a great deal. You'll have, for example, 2 sets of teachers who tell you where your essay writing can improve rather than just your advanced teacher. So you'll do better at analyzing unseen texts because that occurs in both extension and advanced. You'll do better in creative writing. You'll just be a better English student in general. Secondly, what you can do is self-plagiarize. So if you've written a creative for extension, and you've added in all these fancy techniques that extension tends to say you have to have, like intertextuality, metafiction. What you can do is use that or adapt it in some way for advanced when you have to do advanced creatives, or you can write that for your module C, which is in advanced. So it can save you a bit of time. If you do extension 2, this also applies. So what I did was I had my major work, which was a short fiction in extension 2. And then for advanced, I ended up adapting my 6,000 word major work into this 1,000 word narrative. And it did well and it worked because I had done a year of research into my major work. So I was able to just use that for my advanced. And so it was a pretty polished piece, I would say. So thirdly is you need kind of a safety net because 2 units of English are always going to count in your ATAR no matter what. So again, if you feel like you're a bit weaker in advanced, I'd say that's even more of a reason to pick extension or extension 2 as well. And also extension English is taught very differently to advanced. So you have a lot more freedom. You get to choose sometimes what text to study. For example, your independent research project in extension. So if you think that you're not really enjoying advanced, then don't let that kind of steer you away from choosing extension because it's quite different and you might surprise yourself and end up enjoying it. Okay. Yeah, and finally, a quick note on memorizing quotes. By the time you get to the HSC, you'll probably have around 50 or so quotes you'll have to memorize, analysis, things like that. In the best case scenario, you've naturally memorized it over the year, but in case you haven't, I think it's also really useful to figure out what methods work for you. For example, people use flashcards, whiteboards, speaking out loud, all these different ways to memorize. Just try them out throughout your senior years until you land on a method that works for you, so you're not stressed about forgetting your quotes when you get to the actual exam. So for example, for me, I just read my quotes aloud and then a couple times, and then they're pretty much memorized. Okay, so secondly, on essay specific tips. First thing, again, sounds basic, but read your texts. And this doesn't, so in junior years, maybe you can get away with looking at a plot summary online potentially and using online notes, but in senior years, it's a lot different. The requirements are higher, the expectations are higher. You're expected to have a really in-depth knowledge of your texts, and this means you should be reading them multiple times through. First time maybe to just understand the text, but then the second time around, you should be going in with highlighters, sticky notes, things like that to leave your own annotations with the syllabus in mind. So this is especially important since we have a new set of prescribed texts. So you might have texts that there aren't as many resources online. So it becomes a lot more dependent on your own understanding of the text. Second thing is prioritize adapting your base essay to different questions. So when you go into the HSC, you'll have a set of quotes, analysis, and paragraphs prepared for your essays. However, you need to be actively practicing how to change those, maybe change pieces of analysis or sub in different quotes for different questions, and make sure you're familiar with all the types of questions that can pop up. So you can have an extract question where they give you an extract from the text, and then you have to use that to form the basis of your essay and also analyze that part of the extract that they give you. There are also statement questions where they'll have a statement like, literature transcends the bounds of time, and to what extent does the text you've studied reflect that? Or you have very general questions like, how are texts relevant to changing context, things like that. So make sure that prior to the HSC, you've kind of covered all your bases and you know how to tackle each question type. The third thing is to link your techniques closely to your analysis. So a lot of the times the technique in the paragraph or the sentence ends up being an afterthought, like you've found a quote and you've analyzed it, but now you're like, oh, I need a technique, let's just say alliteration or something. You should really be trying to link your technique with your analysis. So for example, if you really want to use alliteration, which probably shouldn't, instead of just saying, this is alliteration and then here's my analysis, maybe the alliteration creates like a very like fast-paced effect, and that reflects the speaker's really frenzied tone, frenzied state of mind or something. Not the best example, but your technique should be really closely connected to your analysis. And next thing is prepare spare quotes for unexpected questions. For example, they can ask you about specific concepts like maybe memory or loyalty, and sometimes you'll have to have entire spare paragraphs. So for my module A, I did Don and Wit. So Don is a poet who had 6 poems we studied. So I I had to have a paragraph for each poem in case the HSC question asked for a specific poem. And in the end, I only used 2 of those poems. But just know when you need to have spare things prepared, and also account for that when you're deciding how much time you should spend on English. English advanced especially is a very large endeavor. You have a lot of work to do. So make sure you prioritize English enough, especially if you're someone who maybe doesn't like English as much. You should be spending a lot of time on it because it is a lot of work and it is really important to your end of year results. And finally, try to find something interesting to say in your analysis. Maybe people interpret the ending of this particular film as really positive, but maybe you have a way to interpret it as kind of a negative ending, for example. So just try find something new because markers are reading the same essays over and over again. So try not to bore them too much. Maybe if you have some unique analysis, that could be good for you. Okay. So thirdly, onto creatives and / discursives, some of my general tips or strategies for approaching them. Firstly, what I like to do is I set a timer, for example, 15 minutes, and I just force myself to write and develop this idea for a creative I have. And for 15 minutes, basically very minimal thinking, like I'm not stopping to question a word or search up a new word, I'm just writing. This is to try and overcome perfectionism, or a lot of people get stuck like trying to make one word perfect or tweaking one sentence, especially when it comes to creative writing. So just remember, an imperfect first draft is always better than no draft. Just force yourself to start. Secondly it's really important to read widely, in particular short fiction, because what you're writing is going to be short fiction. It's going to be around 1,000 words or even less. So obviously reading novels is good, but if you want to know how to characterize really quickly and set up a setting, for example, in 100 words, you should be reading short fiction. You should be searching out short fiction. There are also opinion pieces in newspapers and also sites like Literary Hub, which are really good sources of inspiration for discursives, especially since the structure of a discursive is a bit more wishy-washy. It's good to just read a lot so you kind of get a general gist of how you would write one yourself. And also, NSW every year publishes the Young Writers Showcase, which has a lot of English extension to works. So reading that can also be helpful for to see kind of what is achievable, I guess, or as a source of inspiration. Next thing is don't be afraid to experiment with form. For instance, if you can do a hybridized discursive and creative piece, that's what I actually wrote this year in the HSC because the question specified a discursive and I had a discursive, but it just had some creative elements, so I was able to write that. And you could also do, for example, a narrative, but you put parts of poetry in it. So when you're tackling Module C in year 12, a way to kind of elevate your writing and also maybe have a bit more fun when you're writing is to experiment with form. Second, next is really important, I think, is to ground your writing in something real. Oops, sorry. So whether it be a real setting, a real person, and you're fictionalizing parts of their lives, or a real event that happened, it gives you something to start with. You don't have to create your own world yourself. You can just kind of write off of something real. And it's also often more engaging because your reader has something that maybe they know a little about in the real world, but they don't know a whole lot. So when they're reading your text, you're giving them this new information that they can make links to with what their pre-existing knowledge. So it becomes like a fun mental like exercise or something for the reader. So things are just generally more interesting when they have something real in them, and it keeps your writing authentic. And linked to that is the final tip, which is research is so crucial to writing creatives and discursives. So I see a raised hand, but we'll just, if you could hold your question until the Q&A at the end. So what we did in extension 2 was you can split your research into 2 sections. Firstly, you want to research into your concept, which is the idea. For example, if you're researching about the treatment of war brides during World War II or something. So do a lot of research into your concept to make sure whatever you're writing is authentic, but also what often gets forgotten is research into form. If you're writing poetry, see how established poets talk about how they write poetry, what they really are careful about. If you're writing short fiction, read books like How to Write Short Fiction by established authors, because often they give you like really interesting tips or things you can use in your own writing. For like most of us, we've like, after we leave primary school, there's no one really telling us, here's all the single things, all the steps to do to write a narrative. Most people kind of just go with the flow. They just sit down and they just start writing without really thinking too much about what they're exactly doing. So keep doing research into form even as you get into your senior years in English. Okay, now finally on time management in general. So the first question is how to allocate your time. Let's say you have 5 hours in a day to study. How do you decide what you're going to do first? How much time you're going to spend on each thing? So my first tip is allocate enough time to English because 2 units will always be counted and advanced is a lot of work. The second is focus on allocating enough time to the subjects you enjoy the least, because what can happen is you don't like a subject, so you just naturally spend less time doing it. But it's really important that you actually switch it the other way around. For example, maybe you do the subject you dislike first, so later when you're more tired, you're doing a subject that you like more and that you're more engaged in, so you don't just quit, basically. And next, allocate enough time to yourself. Take care of your mental health. Make sure you get enough sleep, because otherwise your brain just doesn't work great. And make sure you're still seeing your friends, things like that. So next question is, how do you then execute time management, or how do you time block your day? I think firstly, find an app or method that works for you. For example, you can use Notion, you can use Google Calendar to plan out your day. You can use the Notes app or just physical to-do lists. And an extra optional thing you can do is use an app to track the time you spend studying each subject. So I used an app called YPT, and this can help you time block more accurately in the future. For example, you can see in the statistics section of the app what subjects you're neglecting that you need to spend more time on, what subjects you're spending too much time on. Maybe you can see how long it takes you to memorize one essay or to do one past paper and review it. So this helps you allocate your time more effectively when you get into the later stages of HSC prep. Okay, so as an example, what worked for me is I just used Google Calendar to time block my day as I got more and more busy and used it to create to-do lists. So on the left is an example of what my calendar looked like, I think, near the first week of HSC. So as you can see, and then on the right is more of like a in-depth look at a single day. So I just like to block out a couple of hours to do one thing and then try my best to follow that. If it doesn't work, I can just move things around on Google Calendar. Yeah. And then I liked Google Calendar because it allowed me to color code and it was like really easy to use. Okay, yeah. And then I use YPT, like I said, to track the time I spent on each subject. And YPT also blocks off apps on your phone, so that was useful. So for example, this is from year 11. I was able to see that I was spending way too much time on modern history. So in year 12, I kind of set limits and forced myself to move on or kind of do mod, I guess, later in the day, so that I wasn't spending as much time on it. And yeah, and then I also use Notion for more complex like lists of tasks, and so I could set like how my progress for each task, but it was a bit too complicated, so I just ended up not using it later on during the actual HSC. Okay, really quickly, because I'm not sure how we're doing on time, a few other tips on time management is your time is limited, so focus on studying efficiently. I think studying efficiently is really the key to being able to manage your time or having enough time. So make sure that after you do trials, you're revising your notes for every subject instead of just forgetting everything you just learnt for trials and then having to rememorize it 2 weeks prior to the HSC. So that time between trials and HSC really shouldn't be that much of a break. You should be staying on top of everything and just not forgetting the things you learnt. Know your syllabus dot points and what is most likely to come up in the HSC exams, so you can spend more time on what is most likely to come up. When you're creating your notes, you should basically have a dot point from the syllabus, and then under there, the information to answer that dot point. So that's how to most effectively create your notes. And keep a question bank of all the mistakes you make. This goes for math, this goes for multiple choice for like legal studies, HSIEs, this goes for all the sciences. So you don't keep making the same mistakes multiple times, because that's like a huge time waster. Next is to start early. So use your summer holidays between your first term of year 12 and the rest of year 12 wisely, because you'll only just get progressively busier throughout year 12. So during that time, if you can, you know, edit all your essays, use all the feedback you've received, get a head start on reading your texts, read them early, make your own annotations early, things like that. And then also avoid comparing yourself to others, especially when it comes to, you know, how many hours you studied today. Like, oh, so-and-so studied 10 hours. That's kind of crazy. Because ultimately the numbers don't really matter so much. You have to remember that everyone studies at a different speed. Everyone is able to focus for different amounts of hours or minutes at a time. So really just focus on doing the best you can and making sure you're balancing your mental health with all the other stresses of year 12. Next thing is try out different study environments to see what works best for you. So I ended up going to cafes, I went to libraries with my friends a lot, and I always had music blasting in my headphones because that's just what helped me study the best. Obviously for you, it's going to be different. So use year 11 and year 12 to find a method that works for you. And for juniors or people who haven't chosen your subjects yet, choose subjects you have a genuine interest in, because ultimately, no matter how efficiently you block out your time or how well you organize your schedule, that doesn't help if you just genuinely hate the subject you're doing and you don't want to spend another second on it, and you're just learning really slow because you can't get yourself to be interested in the subject. I ended up doing the amount of subjects I did and like the extra units because I just genuinely enjoyed all the subjects I was doing and I couldn't figure out which one to drop. So, and that's what ultimately helped me be able to handle it all. So, yeah, I think that's the end of my presentation.
We might wrap up now. Well, I hope everyone in the audience enjoyed this webinar as much as I did listening to it. And I just want to mention, if you did like our speakers and want to learn from them, both of them have courses at TopLogic, which you can view under the English tab on the TopLogic website. And if I was in high school, I'd love to learn from these two teachers, so I would recommend it. And just to wrap up, just thank you again to Mrs. Harper and Nara for joining us tonight. If you guys have any unanswered questions, I'd get in contact with the TopLogic admin who can put you through to both the speakers. But otherwise, have a good evening, everyone, and hopefully we'll see you at TopLogic or at future webinars.